Hi everyone, I have a rose robin watercolour tutorial for you today. A husband of one of my patrons on Patreon is a photographer, and he very generously gave me permission to use some of his bird photos as reference for my paintings. Now, I take a lot of bird photos myself, but I've never come across a rose robin, so I was very excited to see that he had a photo of one, and I wasted no time in painting it. In this video, I use a mixture of wet on wet and wet on dry painting techniques, and I'll show you how I painted a few different parts of the robin. I've listed all the brushes and paints that I used in the description below. This is my finished painting, and this was painted with kind permission from Roger Fance, who's an Aussie photographer. I've listed his website where you can see more of his beautiful photos in the description. I'm painting on Arches cold press watercolour board, and I've just mixed up some grey for myself with some ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I'm just painting this onto the head. I wet the paper first with some water, so I'm painting on damp paper here. And I'm using my Vinci Maestro brush. This is a number 3. I like to paint on the damp paper because it gives me more time and I can drop other colours in on top before the paint dries. And now I've got some watery Winsor violet that I'm just dropping onto the damp grey paint. And then I wet down further. I take the water down over the wing feathers. And then I bring on some more of that grey paint. So it's just the watery grey. Now I've just got my really fine brush. This is a 00, and I'm just painting some flicks off the side just to create some fine feathers there. So now I'm going to paint the pink feathers on the chest. So I'm just wetting the area with water. There's a pencil line here where the pink feathers stop, so just here. But I've taken my water further than that, down to here. And that will give me a soft edge where the pink feathers stop. I'm going to use some permanent rose to paint the pink feathers in. So I've got some here on my palette. I just mix it up with some water. And then I can paint that onto the damp paper. So when I get down to the pencil line, I'm just going to pat the colour across where the pencil line sits, just so that the paint doesn't go down too much further past it. So just sort of pat it across the pencil line there, and that just gives me that soft edge there. And then I just pull it back up into the pink part. I let the pink dry, and I've re-wet the bottom area now, and I'm just painting some of the grey paint just down on the bottom half of the bird. I've just painted the eye in, and there's a rim of lighter feathers around the outer edge of the eye. So what I've done is I've just painted some water around that rim, and now I'm using some of the grey paint, and I'm just running it along the edge of the pencil line, and then it just bleeds away from the pencil line because of the dampness of the paper. And that gives me that lighter rim around the edge of the eye. Now I've gone ahead and I've painted some feather detail on the head. That'll get covered by a few washes of Payne's Grey just to tone it down. And now I'm just painting in the flight feathers. I'm just using the grey that I mixed up at the start, which was burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. And I'm just painting over my pencil lines, just on the dry paper. I just leave a small gap of the lighter colour showing through just to distinguish one feather from the other. all the way to the final flight feather, and I'll just paint a bit of colour straight on the top of it. Now that it's dry, I'm just going to paint some water over the top, just at the top of the flight feathers here, and then I'll paint some Payne's grey along there. So just paint it hard up against those feathers that are above these ones, and then it just bleeds down onto the flight feathers. Coming back to the pink feathers on the chest now, I've dampened this area with water, and now I'm just painting some permanent rose again, just to deepen the colour. I've also got some permanent magenta down there at the base. And now I've got some more permanent magenta that I'm just putting down here. Just painting on the damp paper. Here I'm painting on some damp paper again, and I'm just using just a touch of ultramarine blue. Just bringing in those little jagged feathers there. And then I use the grey paint again just to paint some little feathers here on the dry paper. I washed the tail in with the grey paint that I used on the head, and now I'm just painting over it with some of the grey paint, but it's slightly darker this time. I'm just painting on the dry paper here, just adding some detail to the tail feathers and separating them from one another. Okay, so I'm just going to start the branch now, and I'm just painting some water onto the front of the branch. So now I've switched down to my smaller 00 brush. I'm using the grey mix. The reason I'm using the smaller brush is because I want to try and leave some white paper showing. I think with the bigger brush, I'll be flooding it with too much paint. So I'm basically just running that grey paint up along the edge, and then it bleeds onto the branch. So if I just run it along the edge, which gives me a nice edge, both edges, and then it bleeds into the middle of the branch. And like I said, I want to try and leave just little areas of white paper showing here and there. The other thing I try and do when I paint branches is I try and use the paints or the colours that I've used on the bird. So I try not to introduce any more colours. So this is just some of the permanent rose now that I'm dropping on. Now I want to leave it mainly around the bird. I don't want to really take it out to the edges of the branch. I'll do the top of the branch up here the same way. So I've just wet it with water. Now I'm using the grey mix. And I'll put a bit of pink or a bit of the permanent rose down near the head. So do the same thing out here. I did the grey first, then the permanent rose, and a touch of the Winsor violet as well. And that's how the branches look after they've dried. So here I'm just painting a wash of watery Payne's grey over the top of the head, just to tone down all that feather detail that I painted. I still want to be able to see it, but I just don't want it to be so obvious. So I'll do this a few times just to push it back. So I take it right to the edge, and that's just toned down all that feather detail. And there's my finished painting. I hope you enjoyed that. The full-length tutorial that shows you how I painted everything is available for my patrons on Patreon. The link to my Patreon page is in the description below. And I also have a full-length Robin tutorial on Skillshare. Now I've put the link to that class in the description as well. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week with a new tutorial.